All right, welcome everyone to our September 5th meeting of the TAC. And are there any introductions, welcomes for anybody?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think everybody's been here before. Yes.
And we're being recorded this evening, and what is the purpose of that?
Well, this is a public meeting, and so Tom asked if he could record the meeting.
Todd.
Sorry, Todd. Thank you. And so
Okay.
it's a public meeting, yeah.
Okay, well, it's unusual, so I just was curious.
Yep.
Okay, great. First thing is to review the agenda. Well, at the end of our meeting, we'll talk about our next meetings. We have scheduled another one in a couple of weeks, and that is going to get delayed. So we'll talk about meetings in October, and according to Heather, we'll probably need to meet twice in October. So we'll try to figure out what works for most everyone. Are there any other changes to the agenda? Everybody okay with? Yes, sir.
Back on our June agenda, we had a future agenda item for the discussion on the urban reserve planning horizon and the timing of the city council. And it got dropped in the last two. I was wondering if we could add that back in.
Great. Well, the next meeting will be focused on urban reserves. I don't know what the reason is. It may be because we're going to council soon, so, but we'll check with Rebecca and either get that back on there or have her respond.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is that acceptable? Okay. Any other additions or changes to the agenda? Everyone okay with it? Okay. All right. We'll move on then. Are there any public comments? Could you give us your name and where you live, please?
I'm Todd Boyle, and I live at near 30th and Hilliard. And I came tonight. I'm the one who's recording it, and I put all my footage up on YouTube, unedited.
Thank you.
For public, benefit. So basically, the reason I came is because we're talking about housing cost burden statistics, and those are particularly important. At the very bottom of that detail, you'll see that 36,000 households are housing cost burden in Eugene, in the city. And I guess that'd be something like 40% of the population, more or less. Quite coincidentally, the 36,000 is the number of individuals in Eugene trying to live on less than $1,000 a month. This was dredged up by Ann Fifield in the December presentation to the City Council, concluding the Housing Tools and Strategies meetings. So there's many people who can afford $300 a month or less, and so I came to ask you all to hold in mind the fact that many of our fellow Eugenians are being displaced right out of their housing because their housing is being bid out from under them as housing costs increase and the amount of housing for them is actually decreasing. So this is really a pretty big structural problem, and I think all the different boards and commissions involved with the land use planning and housing all need to pull together to solve this difficult problem. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for the comments. The minutes from the August 15th meeting, we'll have that at our next meeting, I guess. And so we'll move on to the topics in our agenda. Just a reminder, if you could make sure you speak in the microphone clearly, so soon everybody can hear. And I guess I'll turn it over to you, Heather and Beth.
Great, thank you. So we are picking back up where we left off in June at our June 20th meeting. I think I erroneously said that we were picking back up with the cost burden charts, but there were actually a couple ahead of that we didn't quite get to. Those are comparison of house value to income, and then also what percentage of income folks are spending on rent. So just got the 2011 compared to 2017 for house value to income. And as you might recall, the last couple of charts that we looked at that were about house sales, those were from ARLID data. It was actual house sales data. This is a little bit different. This is from the census. The reason we used house value from the census is because we were using income data from the census. So we were using the same sources. And the interesting thing about house value is that it is the value that the homeowner says that they think their house is worth based on whatever tools they want to use, be it Zillow, be it they recently bought or sold their house, and so it may be pretty close, or it may be aspirational, or it may be based on Zillow or Redfin. So anyway, just to note, that's why we don't really want to use house value very much, but it does give you a bit of an idea of what people are saying they think their house is worth compared to what their income is. And so what we look at here is kind of what the trend is, or about how basically the proportion of your median income, of the income to the house value. And what you're seeing is that while both house value and income rate both increased from 2011 to 2017, you're still seeing quite a bit of difference between the income. I shouldn't have this clipped on probably, because I know Beth is going to have a lot to contribute. There's still a big difference between the income to the value.
And Heather, do we have as one of the next slides, the ratio?
Yes.
So where we've typically used this, and think it's effective to use it, because we're careful with using the house value from the census for reasons that Heather mentioned, is looking at the change in ratio between income and home value over a long period of time. So for instance, in 2000, I'm going to make up numbers, but they're not that far off, just by memory. In 2000, the median home value was about 3 times the median income, median household income, ish, in Eugene. By 2017, I haven't looked at these data for a while, but I'm going to guess that that number is 4.5 to 5 times. It's certainly up there. And so looking at this longitudinally and looking at the comparison, people probably know their home value better now than they did in 2000. And certainly what was going on in say 2010, 2011 is people still thought their home was worth a lot more than the market thought it was worth at that point. You've got periods of correction, but when you look at those longer term things, you see it illustrates a structural change in the relationship between income and housing costs for owners. And that structural change, you haven't seen it change as much for renters, although in the last few years you've seen rental costs grow faster than incomes. But you haven't seen it do that as fast over a long period of time for rent. And there's reasons for that. So.
Yeah, and it looks like I accidentally didn't put the ratio of house value to income in the Word document I sent you, but here it is, and so you see that there is that little bit of shift. It's a little bit better, but it's still pretty rough. And I want to apologize for those of you that are fans of Star Wars, and you know how at the beginning of the movie the text goes in at an angle. That is not what I was trying to get at here. Something's going on. I couldn't fix it, but you could pretend we're watching Star Wars if you want. So any questions or comments about either of those two charts? It seems like it is helpful to have both of them. I apologize for not having both of them. Do you want to give him the, yeah.
I'm curious, could you define what census calls income? I assume it's not investment
No,
dollars?
it's income, if I'm remembering correctly, it's income reported on your tax income, and so your taxes. We're talking household income here. rather than family income. So it's generally speaking wages. Yeah.
So similarly, we wanted to look at a similar comparison for renters. And so you can't quite do the same comparison, but what this is the percentage of renter monthly income that is spent on rent. So I'll just let you look at that for a second.
Could you zoom in a little bit?
Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
That's even better.
There we go.
Should be able to
I have
go
it on
full
my
screen.
phone too.
I
I have it on my phone.
think I am full screen.
It's okay.
Does that work?
Mhm.
Okay. So, yeah, so you're seeing, I mean, technically you're seeing a slight change since between 2011, the beginning of our monitoring period, or right before the beginning of the monitoring period, and then 2017 data. But because it's ACS data, it's sample data, you know, whether or not there's actually been a decrease, probably isn't really there, and it's, again, still a lot. They're still spending a lot on rent. I can also pull up.
So, given that the baby boomer population is growing, and people don't have,
Aging.
aging, and I think percentage of population is growing also, isn't it? Okay. But how does that figure in if somebody's living off retirement funds?
Exactly.
Which is not, I mean, it would seem to me it would skew the bottom some.
It certainly does. So wealth is not taken into account here. And there's no source of data that tells us wealth at the state level even. The data at the federal level, it tells us some stuff about wealth, and that may or may not be true in Oregon, but we have no information about wealth. So you can certainly, where you might see this is, say, homeowners who are cost burdened. And you can divide homeowners who are cost burdened down into two groups, those with a mortgage and those without a mortgage. Homeowners who are cost burdened without a mortgage, so they're cost burdened because of their taxes and their insurance, they're probably the ones who are in big trouble, because that's usually not that much here in Oregon. The homeowners who are cost burdened with a mortgage, some of them may well have quite high income, and some of them may well have a fair bit of wealth. So you have to keep that into account. How many people who have a lot of wealth would you say, and this is a judgment, are renting? I would think that it would be a lower percentage of people who are fairly wealthy who are renting. They're more likely to be homeowners. So when you're looking at renter households, you sort of get that larger concentration of people who are just in desperate straits.
The other thing I wanted to note here is that comparing Eugene to Lane County in Oregon, again, you're seeing that Eugene renters typically have spent more, at least, and this holds true through the monitoring period, I didn't bring that up, but more than in Lane County and in Oregon as a whole.
Does this data include, I'm just wondering if it maybe is reflected in Eugene being higher by us having a higher percentage of students?
Yes, that's certainly part of it, because we're looking at households rather than families. So Eugene, Corvallis, they're going to be different than the state averages.
But because we have more more rental stock because we have more student housing, you're saying that that would result in us having people spending more on rent? Okay.
Yes, student households tend to have lower incomes.
Right.
And so they're spending more on rent. And of course,
Got it.
this is not students who are in dormitories. That's all separate. So that's why when you look at a place like Eugene or Corvallis and you look at the difference between median household income and median family income, it's a bigger difference than if you looked at it for the state as an average. It's our proportion of students, and it's more exaggerated in Corvallis, where the university is proportionately larger compared to the whole city.
Okay, so moving into cost burden. We have a couple different ways that we have identified this or put together charts. The first one is just all households. And so we did a comparison of Eugene to Oregon. We could add Lane County there, but again, with Eugene making up so much of Lane County, it seemed like Oregon was a better comparison. And so what you're seeing here is that Eugene, all households have been more cost burdened. There are more percentage of our households that have been cost burdened than they have been in Oregon. And that's it. I mean, this seems significant here. And we can look at that over the monitoring period as well.
And how is cost burden defined?
Cost burden is, so we're using HUD guidelines, and that is that households are paying more than 30% of their income on housing.
Costs.
On housing costs, and that includes utilities, I believe, is that
Some
right?
utilities.
Yeah, some utilities. And then cost burden can even be broken out more into cost burden and severely cost burden. So that's something that we are recommending adding to, I think it's this chart. Because severely cost burden is even worse. And so it's really helpful to know what segment of your population is experiencing that. And I believe for Eugene is pretty high.
Severely cost burden is spending 50% or more of your gross income, this is pre-tax income, on housing costs. And the state's emphasizing that cities look at severely rent burdened households, so households that are rent burdened that are spending 50% or more of their income on housing costs.
My question is, do we know if that specifies what percentage, or try to figure out how to want to ask this, are dual households, like with two incomes, or what? Because I think that would probably make a difference. Does that make sense? So, if do we know what the breakdown of those households are? Are they single family or single parent households? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So you could look at that, certainly, to some extent. I don't think that there's good information that you could look at that directly goes to number of workers per household.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly you could look at, cost burden by household type, so single parent households.
Okay.
But you can't necessarily look at it by number of workers, but you can get to average number of workers per households in different sort of ways. You can also look at cost burden by income level. And so you see that, households that earn less than $25,000 a year are much more cost burdened than households that even earn $50,000 a year. And it's a very predictable pattern that you see. I've seen it in every city I've worked with.
Okay.
Wait, can you say that again?
Households that earn less, so less than $25,000, are much more likely to be cost burdened than households that earn more. It's a little bit obvious.
Right.
But there's a big break between households that earn less than 25,000 and 25 to 50,000. The percentage of households that are cost burdened goes down really quickly as you go up the income level. But you still have a little smidgen of high income households that are cost burdened.
Everything I've read is that issue is not unique to Eugene, Oregon. I'd be interested to know, maybe like regionally, West Coast, as well as nationally, how those percentages break out. Just because I guess as I said, my impression is that this is not just a Eugene or Oregon problem. It's nationwide, and I think it's valuable to at least have that perspective as well. That this is a huge national problem.
Yeah, I think we can get nationwide pretty easy, and it seems like that would be. Yep, that's happening. So yeah, apparently we're in the South all of a sudden. But yeah, so I think we could do that, and I think it would be appropriate to add maybe to the comprehensive report, maybe not the annual report, but the comprehensive report is where we've talked about doing more comparisons, if that makes sense to folks, putting something like that in there.
Oh, so close. Up. Oh, why can't I read this right? Good. Hello. Can we? In the thing I was curious about, which there is a slide about it, but for doing that, comparing other household incomes along with that comparison, I think would help to understand that information. No.
The median income?
Yes.
What do you mean?
If we're going to compare, if we're going to do what Howard was saying, to also have information about what, if we're doing regionally, what the median income is for that area too, so we can have both of those together. Because if the income, like somewhere that you get paid a lot more for, I don't know, but.
So incomes in, say, the Bay Area are really high.
Right.
But housing prices are really, really high.
Right.
And so cost burden there is at least as high as it is here.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason that cost burden is as high as it is here is that incomes are proportionately lower compared to a lot of the West Coast.
Right. So yeah, just those two would help, I think, bring that piece together.
I apologize if this is very close to Tiffany's question. I didn't catch all of it, but in terms of other household types, can we look at it through household, like number of people in each household rent burden?
Maybe, I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up, but I cautioned you to start realizing that you're getting near to the edge of where your data is just going to start to be poor. Put another way, if you chop all of this data up into smaller and smaller pieces, your margin of error goes up higher and higher. And so, I mean, certainly I think the city, I'm not sure if that table exists, that comparison exists. If it does, my advice to Heather would be we look at the margin of error and make sure that it's acceptable.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I'd really appreciate trying to find that if we can.
Okay, so it's number of units that are cost burdened by rent or own.
By number of persons per household.
Number of persons per, ooh, boy, okay.
That's the topic.
Okay, the other thing I wanted you to look at was format here. So in this case, we've got Oregon and Eugene's side by side. The other option is to have them broken out and side by side. Does either of those strike you better? This has been the more consistent format we've been doing, but when it gets more complicated, we pull them out. But it doesn't sound like people think it needs to be pulled out. Okay, great. I can't remember on this one. So this one, again, for the comprehensive report, looking at polling in comparisons to nearby cities. Springfield's an obvious one for comparison, and then Coburg and Cresswell. We had some discussion last time, though, about which charts it made sense for which cities to show. So I'd like to revisit that on this one, because we kind of went round and round and decided to table that and come back, but it was like, I think it was sales, rent, median income. Do we show it for all the cities? Do we just show it for some of them? We went a little bit round and around, and it seems like however we decide that, we would want to do the same thing here, because this is combining both of those data points. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah, because of the unique nature of being a college town, would it, rather than Creswell or Coburg, which are, just like little bedroom areas in some ways for Eugene, would it be better to compare us to Corvallis and Salem and other Oregon college towns?
For cost burden specifically?
Mm-hmm. And housing?
Yes and no. So I would say Salem's not so much a college town. It's got a college, but Corvallis is an interesting comparison. Ashland, maybe. But if you look at places like Cresswell and Cottage Grove and Bonita, they're tiny, but they're alternatives, and they're local alternatives. So you could, my sister-in-law bought a house in Cottage Grove because she couldn't afford a house in Eugene, and it didn't have so much to do with the fact that Eugene is a college town as a regional employment center, and prices here are higher than their income would support. So I think looking at Corvallis might be interesting. I'm not sure if looking outside of Oregon at a bunch of college towns would be interesting. We did that for Corvallis at one point. It was vaguely interesting, but not all that interesting. But I think Corvallis is also close enough that it's easy to commute between Eugene and Corvallis. And so, if you put that on the list of comparator cities, it makes some sense from a couple of perspectives.
Are we okay with not doing that then, based on that?
Well, let's see. I'm thinking ahead and kind of thinking back at the same time, because one of the issues that came up all the time during infill compatibility standards and Envision Eugene is that the policies that we do here in Eugene have an impact on our outlying bedroom communities like Junction City, Cottage Grove, Cresswell, even Oak Ridge, I don't know. But I think we need, if we're really going to do monitoring well, I think we need to see what's happening in those small communities and compare them to Eugene.
Yeah, I just meant the other cities, like the Corvallis or the other
Okay.
cities. But yeah, my plan is with those handful of ones that we talked about last time, income, rent, I think it was sales price, which we know we're gonna do, and then cost burden. I feel like there was one more that we kind of went round and round about which cities to show, and that's a lot of data, and do we need all of them? I'll go ahead and make all of the charts, and then when we're actually putting the report together, we'll just throw them in there, and then we can decide what it makes sense to include. Because some of it could be too much data. It could be interesting, but it actually doesn't really help us. And some of them it might be more helpful.
On sales price data, when you get out of Lane County, you can't get it from Arlid anymore. You could get it from the assessor probably in that county. So just be conscious of the fact that
Yeah, we're not.
Be conscious of the fact that your sales price data is from a local source.
Yep. Yeah, we're doing, it's Lane County cities that we're using.
Okay.
Out of Arlid.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, so here's an example where we had cost burden for Springfield. And then don't look at that ugly chart for a minute. Okay, so now moving into splitting it out by renters versus owners. So this is another one where I want to get your feedback on format. But just to start with, what you're seeing is not a huge change between owners that are cost burdened, a little bit more of a difference between renters that are cost burdened, the orange there. And then similar to the previous chart where it was all households, again, Eugene is overall higher than Oregon with cost burden for renters specifically. And so that makes sense given our discussion about the student population. And I'll add that in the report. The other thing I would note is that the difference between cost burden households that are owners. So you're looking at like a third of owner households versus over half, almost 60% or more. It's pretty significant. And then you are going to have to look at this chart for a minute because this is how we've designed it, and it probably doesn't work very well. But what you've got here is owners and renters for each year. And just as a reminder, the historic data is just kind of grayed out. So it's there for you to see, but it's grayed out a little bit. Do you want me to make this bigger?
Yes.
There we go. Is that good?
Can you do one more?
Yep. So you can see, actually it's kind of helpful that they're so different because you can see, the owners are, again, over the years, about a third, and renters over the years is about 60%. In 2013 it was 65. Again, we're dealing with ACS sample data, but it's 60% of renter households in our community are cost burden, and that's a pretty consistent trend here. And even if you look at the 2000 and the 2010 data, it's not much different.
Well, what I would say is different is your renter cost burden went up by a fair chunk since 2000. Owner cost burden went up a little bit.
Yeah.
It's the longitudinal changes and the general pattern that I think are important from the ACS data.
Would you consider maybe doing a line graph rather than a bar chart for trends if you want to, if that's what you're trying to look at? Just a suggestion.
Yeah, so actually what I was going to suggest is we don't have owner and renter right next to each other, that you would actually break them out into two separate charts. Yeah. Does that work? The same?
Yeah, you can do it. You can do it on the same chart too.
Want to talk about line charts?
Yeah. And you could take the not cost burdened alpha there. So you're just showing only cost burdened.
Yeah.
That would make it a little less busy.
Mm-hmm.
Question for you, Beth, I need a little help. I'm looking at all these charts, and it shows that the cost burden has actually improved over 2011. And that isn't what's happening on the street, in my opinion. Can you explain what the census has done to show that improvement? Because I don't think it's real.
I was struggling with that myself, Ed. And so the question ends up being, will you go back to the one that shows Oregon? Is it a Eugene sampling problem? Well, no, Oregon's gone down in the same way. So 55% in 2011 for renters in Oregon, 52% in 2017. It's gone down more in Eugene. So maybe there's some sample error issue, with the gone down, but probably not the trend, the direction down. And so I think what's probably happened is that incomes have risen just enough to put people over the edge of not being cost burden a little bit more. And if we had severe cost burden on here, we would have a more nuanced story, because I think what's happening, and I don't know this for sure in Eugene, but you get a higher concentration, a larger percentage of people who are severely cost burdened, and so really in trouble because they're paying more than 50% of their income on housing costs. They're not doing it that I know of. They're not doing it statistically differently. The data, when you look at it in the background, and all the definitions and all of that are all the same. So.
Do you think, I mean, is it related to incomes that might have increased and just been that tipping point, or is it also related, maybe it's correlated to that, but employment? Because if you looked at post-recession in 2011, we had a pretty high unemployment rate here in Eugene for sure, and then in
Right.
2017, we've come down a lot.
I don't know why I didn't think that. I should have thought that. But yeah, that's got to be part of what it is.
And the people are displaced.
Thanks, Phil.
And so with that, with the idea of revising this chart, this one, I guess this one, and if you guys think I should also take off not cost burden on this one as well, I could, and instead add severely cost burden to all of them. So that would emphasize the issue more than having data on there that isn't. I mean, that's great for those folks, but we are trying to focus on the other folks. And actually, this is a great segue because now we're going to talk about employment data from the census and from Bureau of Labor and Statistics about wages and income, so we can kind of make some of those connections. Does that work for everyone to move on?
Yeah, any questions about this?
Yeah, okay. Does anyone need a break?
Yep, I think we're
Not yet.
Moving along?
onward.
All right. Okay, so speaking of pay, average annual pay of jobs in the jurisdiction. So this information is coming from OED, so we feel pretty good about this data. We don't have the same margin of error sample issues that we have with the census. So average annual pay or average wage per employee, meaning the average annual pay of the jobs in the jurisdiction, not of the residents in the jurisdiction. So I just kind of want to make that distinction that this is actually about what the jobs are making. So we have this information for Lane County, Oregon, and the U.S. So you, yeah. Sorry, yes.
So what this data is from is the quarterly census of employment and wages, QCEW data. So all companies that have unemployment insurance, they're required to report information about the number of employees and their total wages to the state on a quarterly basis. And it's by month. And so we can get that, and we know where the businesses are located. So that's how we can tell, you know, Eugene UGB versus Springfield UGB, for instance. So this is just covered employment. This doesn't include employment that's not covered. And so employment that's not covered tends to be things like sole proprietors. Railroad employees. I don't know why railroad employees aren't covered employment, but it's another weird little group that aren't covered. And so non-covered employment isn't shown in this data, and there's not you can't get total employment at the city level in the same way that we can get this at the city level. So this is pretty special data that the state allows the city to have access to. It's very confidential. We can't say how much, say, Echo Northwest. We can say how much City of Eugene pays and how many employees there are, because public places aren't covered at all by that confidentiality.
And so what we saw over the monitoring period was that pay for jobs in Lane County rose about 7.7%, compared to in Oregon, they rose about 10.2%. So, just getting back to what we were just talking about, there has been an increase in wage. And I think, if I remember correctly, if we went back to the median income, we did see a slight increase in median income as well.
You could add Eugene to this chart if you just simply had the QCEW data for Eugene. So it's a matter of getting it from LCOG or from the state.
Okay.
I didn't think of that the other day, sorry.
That's okay. So another way to look at this is looking at the per capita income of residents in the jurisdiction. And one thing I want to note now that we're moving into blue is that because there are so many charts, we did a little bit of color coordination. So charts that are about housing and people are mostly going to be orange, and charts that are about employment, jobs, mostly about income, those are going to be blue. And those have to do with the pillars of Envision Eugene. So hearkening back to that, we did some color coding with that, and so we're trying to kind of follow some of those color cues for folks. So per capita income of residents in the jurisdiction. So instead of talking about jobs, what are residents making? This is the mean income that's computed for everybody, including those living in group quarters, and it's derived by dividing the aggregate income of a particular group by the total population in that group. So it's an average. Whereas average, like I said, whereas average annual pay is the pay of the jobs in the jurisdiction, per capita is about what the residents in the jurisdiction, that live in the jurisdiction, are making regardless of where they actually work, regardless of where their job is. This is from the census, so we're back to census, ACS 1-year data, and what you're seeing is a bit of an increase. Let's see. One of the things that you noted for me was that before 2017, that per capita income was actually pretty stable. Is that right?
Somewhere
It didn't
in there,
grow substantially.
It was slow for, I don't know exactly when it started changing because I haven't looked at that data recently, but it was lagging in there.
I'll just pull up this guy so you can kind of see it over time. Too much.
And this would be affected by what Phil was talking about, unemployment, since this is just total pay, per capita income rather. So I'd be willing to bet that jump in 2013 is reflective of changes in unemployment. And then the jump a little bit later is reflective of actual changes in wage. I mean, I don't care exactly how big the jump is because margin of error, but.
So just to clarify, per capita is per head. So non-working people, children, it's true per capita, it's not per worker.
Yep.
Does that explain the difference between your last numbers? You talked about a 7% increase in job wages, and this reflects about a 28% increase. The last one you showed for 2011 to 2017 was 24.2 or something. That shows like a 28% increase. Seems like there's no correlation between the two, and I understand it's per capita, but
I think it's got to be that pay increased somewhat, but number of jobs increased, and thus overall income increased. And of course, the income we're talking about here is for people who live in Eugene versus people who work in Eugene. And as when we get to commuting data, you'll see that those are not 100% overlapping at all. So I would say that some of the difference is going to be explained by change in level of employment. There's more jobs, so there's more income. More people are working now. But the amount of how much is being paid per job hasn't changed as much. It's changed a little.
So is there a way, as Phil mentioned earlier, to try to correlate that or somehow index it by using unemployment numbers? I mean, the two to me, if I look at those, go, what does that tell me? Because they're so dramatically different. But if there's something that correlates the two over time, such as, say, unemployment going from whatever we were, 5 or 6% down to we're at 3.2 or whatever it is now.
Oh, we were up in well above 10%.
Okay, whatever
so
the
it was very high.
numbers were.
Certainly, there's a way to do that in terms of mathematical correlation. I'd have to actually ask somebody who does more of the quantitative work and looking at indexing.
But I guess overall, does that, I mean, for the level of work that we're doing, does this give us enough information to kind of understand at a high level what's going on with incomes and jobs?
Is unemployment information presented in another part of the monitoring?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we haven't gotten to unemployment, the unemployment chart yet, but we will.
Okay, I guess my background's in stat too, so my concern gets to be that you keep loading so many charts and so many numbers in, that when somebody gets done reading 30 pages, they go, so what did I really learn? It's just a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I'll hold my exact feelings about it until we actually see sort of what the report looks like, but I mean, just looking at those two, without a lot of explanation, they make no sense with each other. And if I'm just reading this report, I look at that and go, okay. And you get to a point where you put too many charts in and too many people are gonna pull out whatever they wanna pull out, and you're gonna have trouble, you're just gonna be fighting, explaining everything.
Yeah,
And I'm trying to be
yes.
transparent, but it's like, you don't wanna just create documents that are just horribly confusing.
Totally. And so we did share a draft of what the document would start to look like. And some key components of that are at the beginning and they're blank because we don't have all the data yet. But I think the goal would be that in the beginning of the document, you're tying some of those key components together and cross-referencing them with each other. And then also, for each chart or each data point, there's a takeaway. And so what I'm trying to do as we're talking about things, and we'll have to go back and revise it, is make those connections in the takeaway section of each one. So what you guys were just talking about, I'd be kind of cross-referencing average annual pay takeaway with the per capita income and kind of what we think we're seeing there. But I think that's a really good cautionary statement that we want to be really careful about how much data we're putting out there.
Just a question, is this the only graph that cites that particular source? Or are there others that rely upon the same source? And I'll just expand by saying, for whatever the deficiencies are of the ACS as opposed to decennial census data, I think just picking one horse and riding with it is preferable to having maybe too much data, as much of a data freak as I am. But I think to not lose people and to be able to tell a more coherent story, really, but what the data tells you, relying upon consistent sources.
So that source of data is going to be important in the economic development piece. It's very important there. And I would also say that what Heather is setting up is a process for picking up a bunch of rocks and looking under them and saying, is there anything interesting here? A bunch of the rocks are going to be really boring, and occasionally you'll find something sadly very interesting. I would imagine that as you're building the reports, you might well pare down more and more to what the essential pieces are. But having written this kind of thing before, for a community like Eugene that has very engaged, interested, smart people, you need to pick up and look at all the rocks to see if there's a story.
Yeah, and when we get to the number of jobs, the forecasted number of jobs by sector, all that will all be coming from OED. But yeah, I think that's really good. We won't be using all of these charts. I really hope not, because I think we spec'd out that there were like 350 charts, and so they're all there for your, your viewing pleasure. But we definitely don't want to put all of those in the reports. Okay. All right. So even more ways. So I snuck this in here. We already looked at median household income as part of the housing affordability section, but it felt weird to not include median household income as we were talking about average annual wage and per capita income. It seemed like it flowed in there. So again, we won't have to put them in there. We won't have to put all of these in this section of the report, but I just wanted to have it in there as a placeholder. Okay, you can't see this whole thing. So this guy, this is household income distribution. So I know we're still working on our colors a little bit, but what you're seeing here essentially is that a large part of our population in 2011, over 60%, made less than $50,000. And I believe that our median income is $50,592. So we had half of the population making that. That's shifted a little bit in 2017, so that's great. Let's see. And then I think we had Oregon.
That was census.
Yeah,
That's
we're back to
AGI.
census.
AGI.
What's that?
That's AGI.
This
Adjusted
is
gross income on tax returns.
this is from the American Community Survey.
Yeah, but you said it was based on tax returns, adjusted gross income.
I didn't say anything about that. Sorry. Do you want to respond? Did I miss something?
That's the request in the census, is for people to report their income. I'm not sure that it's adjusted gross income. I think it's a simpler question than that, so that you don't have to look at your taxes to answer the census question. What Heather and I were also talking about with that chart is simplifying some of the categories. When you're thinking about what public policy can and might affect, the lower income categories tend to be more important for housing in terms of if you're going to have affordability policies.
Yeah. The other thing we talked about, speaking of not showing all of the charts, is that while I did pull this chart for an annual comparison, it doesn't really, it seems like too much information for an annual report. It seems like it would be more helpful at the comprehensive report level and maybe not showing the in-between years, because you can actually, it's just really busy, and it probably doesn't really provide that much information for folks. But showing something like this more every 5 years, and that would be the same. So yeah, less categories. We would I think condense these top two. So if you make 100,000 or more, and that would reduce our colors as well, which I think would be helpful.
Michelle has a question.
Yeah.
Is there a reason that on some of the charts, we have it starting in 2010, and the other charts like here, we have it starting in 2011.
If it had, like these guys,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so what I tried to do, so when I used 2011, those were for the annual reports, and it was mostly trying to use the data that was available at the time we did our original studies in 2012. And so I started with 2011. For the more comprehensive report, I was trying to put even further back data, more historic data in there. And so I went with 2000 or 2010 or both if they were available. If that's confusing, that's definitely something we can change. That's no big deal.
What?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just liking the consistency of going from 2011 to 2011 to 2017 and like jumping back and forth, and that way those charts they'd respond a little better when you shrunk them down on that other page, versus now it's 2010 and it's like the first time we've seen 2010, and then 2011's not even on here, so
Right.
this one, so
Yeah, I mean, the comprehensive report, the thought was that it would have more historical data in it, just like it would have more comparisons with other cities or the nation. And I did drop off 2011 mostly on the comprehensive report charts because there were already so many bars. So I can definitely add it back in, that's no problem, just for consistency.
If I was gonna give you a piece of advice here, I would look at 2000 data, leave 2011 on there, skip 2010, it's just another ACS year. It's not a special year in that way for this kind of data. And then you get the longitudinal, the long-term difference since 2000. And be aware that the census will change, whether 2000 data is easily available soon. So
Pull it in now, right?
pull it in now.
Does that, just to get closure on that, does that work for folks? Does that feel like it would be a better, okay.
This is just a thought. Your left-hand axis has percentages, but you've got all the percentages built in.
Yeah.
And
confusing.
we're really talking about absolute numbers, for like housing or people, and our population has changed. And I'm just wondering, and this may just be too complicated, but if the vertical axis actually could represent the growth in population, and you've got all your percentages, because is 27% at that lower
What's the
rate?
scale?
Yeah,
Mhm.
in
What
terms
you-
of absolute numbers of people.
Mhm.
What you could do is something like quartiles or quintiles for population and show population there. It would, of course, vary it would be varying the income, so it wouldn't be a nice round number. But you could do something like that, your bottom
Yeah.
quarter.
And I honestly don't know whether that would just be too complicated, but it just seems redundant to have percentages over on the left when you're actually spelling them out. And then it does seem that in 2017, we've got more people than we had in 2010. But like that 27%, compared to 2010, it's a bigger chunk of the world.
And it would be more important if we're looking back at 2000 because of the population difference.
Yeah.
I mean, since you're comparing Eugene to Eugene over a reasonable amount of time, and Eugene hasn't gone from 100 people to 300,000 people, you could graph number of households.
So do people feel like that would be helpful for any time? Because I'm also trying to just have some consistency between them. So anytime there is percentages like this, is that something that would be helpful to give folks a sense of scale rather than just having the percentages? Okay, let's see what we can do here. Great.
I have another question.
Yeah.
My interpretation of this, although you haven't said it explicitly again, is that these are all in constant dollars, right? So there's a genuine increase in income in constant dollars over this period of time, right?
You mean it's not adjusted for inflation?
No,
and
that it
that's
is adjusted for
Oh, yeah, it is,
inflation.
yes.
Right.
So
And-
if it's adjusted for inflation, we actually put that here. Yeah, so most of them are adjusted for inflation.
Okay, well, I think that's very important. But then a second point is, ultimately, we care about these numbers because they will affect policymaking. And other things that will go into policymaking, maybe you're going to get to them yet, are things like tax income to the city or to the county. And to the extent that things like tax income then can be fed back into, changing the housing mix or helping low-income people, for example, then that's an important thing to know about and to be able to assess for the purpose of policymaking. So to me, at least the tax part of this is also an important part of the story. That is income to the city in taxes that should also be going up. Well, I assume they're going up if income is going up. But then it gets complicated because there's also greater expenses and whatnot. But I wonder to what extent will that become part of the story?
The city isn't increasing its revenues because of income, because income tax goes to the state, if I'm right. I'm not an expert on fiscal policy. But certainly the city is getting a change in income as a result of change in property tax. So I'll agree with you there, but I wouldn't say that the change in the city's fiscal picture is directly related to change in income. It's related to change in property tax.
Okay, well, whatever. Then the change in property tax should be part of the story and the consequent income from that.
So I kind of wonder if you're not getting into an area that is very complicated. And not directly related to land use, because property taxes change based on different levies that are out there, and levies expire and new ones come in, and so while overall property assessment can grow at a capped rate per year. I'm not sure that there's a direct enough correlation between how much income the city is getting from property taxes with how property taxes are necessarily, how value of housing is necessarily changing. This might be something you want to chat with your community development department. Ann would probably be able to give you some advice on this.
Okay. Let's bookmark that because
Sure.
it is not something that we were planning on developing charts around. It is very complicated. We are doing kind of high-level land use planning. I could see maybe getting in, maybe there would want to be more discussion around that when you're actually doing policy discussion about what our strategies for growth are, but as part of monitoring, I'm not sure that, we just want to explore that a little bit more if that was something we were going to pursue. That definitely wasn't something we identified in the TRG.
Would you go back to the last chart when you had the income brackets? That one's fine.
Okay.
Your breakouts are constant, 25,000, 2550, 5075, and so on, but the numbers are inflationary. And $100,000 income in 2000 is a whole lot more than $100,000 income in 2020, or 25,000, or whatever the numbers are. So you're going to skew the chart if you use constant brackets because of the inflationary problem. And let's say that we get to inflation where we're at 4 to 5%, it's going to look like that people making less than 25,000 are dropping off the face of the earth, so we must have solved the problem, where we didn't really solve the problem.
Yeah, but then you'll have increased housing costs along with it. And so I would say income is a piece of the equation, but it's a small piece of the equation along with another small piece of the equation, maybe they're big pieces, but rent and owner costs. And so where income is important to understand the distribution of income, that kind of thing, is looking at it in relationship to how housing costs have changed. And that's why some of the earlier charts that Heather showed were pretty important, I think.
I agree, but if you like look at these charts,
Mm-hmm.
I say, well, I guess we're kind of solving some of the income problems because the number of people who are making less than 25,000 is going down. Well, it's not necessarily going down. And what I was getting at is there a way to also show what those numbers are over time without inflation built into them? So that you've got a constant on your chart and you've got constant numbers, constant income.
So I think what you're really asking for is, say, index this at the year 2000 or something like that. I would say you get that through inflation-adjusted average household, median household income.
Do we have that in here?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
This is just a lot more detail. I mean, frankly, I'm not sure how interesting the detail is on some of that, but this is useful. This is adjusted for inflation household income. And this is, in a lot of ways, a pretty important number.
Mm-hmm.
The other stuff, it's detail. It has to be contextualized to understand that, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because in 2000, 50% of our households had income less than $25,000, that we're so much better off now. Because then you have to look at how housing costs have changed.
Right.
Also, in comparing Eugene to Oregon, Eugene consistently had a higher proportion of jobs that paid less than $25,000 than Oregon as a whole. So that also seemed helpful comparison. Another one that might be too much information, but is there it is. No. Is this guy. So this is household income by age of householder. And I think what we would want to do here, we had talked about, what did we talk about?
We talked about having a 2011 graph and a 2017 graph side by
Separating
side.
them out. Yeah.
And honestly, what's important here is seeing that younger households have lower income, a lot larger percentage of lower income households, and that income peaks somewhere around 55 or 65 years old, and then it starts to decline after that. It's a really common pattern that I've seen in all cities, young people, they don't make as much. Once you retire, usually, your income goes down. When you look at the demographics and what's going on with some of that, which I won't go into, but those have profound impacts. That matters. The middle part matters somewhat less, although I think the middle people are happy to be making more income as they get older.
And I think you said this was not just Eugene or Oregon, this is kind of a nationwide pattern that, it typically rises as you get older. So separating those two out, and I think we would do a comparison to Oregon here in the comprehensive report, and I think, again, we would just show this one and the distribution by the different income categories. Those would both just be in the comprehensive report if we need them. Here's Oregon. You can see a similar pattern. Oh, yeah. So you can see why we need to split these out by years, because this didn't really work. But imagine, you would have the years side by side instead of having the different sections side by side. So educational attainment, again, this is one where I think we would revise this chart and we would do the proportions. So this would be a stacked bar chart. So you would have 2011 high school grad or less, and then on top of that would be some college or associate's degree, and then bachelor's or more. I'm not sure, we'd need to think about if it makes sense to do the vertical axis on numbers, like population, instead of the proportions, but we can try that on all of them. Sounds like people were interested in that.
So I kind of wonder, Heather, we're still in housing here, right?
Employment.
Okay, we've stepped into employment.
Yep, with the blue.
Blue, okay, all right.
Yeah.
I was getting myself confused. Okay, then my question disappears.
And so what we talked about, again, this is not a direct input into the land supply model. Most of this stuff hasn't been. It's just giving us context about the community. Again, we compare Eugene to Oregon. Eugene continues to have a higher proportion of residents with a bachelor degree or more than Oregon as a whole. Not surprising with the university. So it just gives you some context about our workforce and probably also our income a little bit in Eugene. So there's Oregon, 29 to 34%, and then Eugene is 38 to 44% with a bachelor's degree or more. So pretty noticeable difference. And then our most hotly contested how to title this chart, where Eugene residents work on the left, and where Eugene workers live, or where workers in Eugene businesses live. There's a lot of fun ways to say it. But essentially what you're seeing here is that the overall takeaway is about 70% work in Eugene Springfield that are Eugene residents. And consistently over half of those that work in Eugene also live in Eugene Springfield. You can see that a little bit better on this guy over here. So we have a very localized workforce, I guess is the way I would kind of put it. Sue?
Heather, I was shocked when I saw that 39% of Eugene workers live outside of Lane County. Is that really true?
So, Eugene workers, 39%,
Live.
according to the census.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, you have more insight on that.
I would end up double checking that. That's a little surprising, but it's also not that surprising.
Well, I can
necessarily.
imagine it outside of Eugene, but outside of Lane County seems really surprising to me. I mean, Lane County is huge.
Mhm.
Well, double check it, but we've also got a lot of people who work in Corvallis and in Salem. What ends up happening that ends up being a little surprising to me is a lot of people end up working in unincorporated areas. And so what I suspect here we've got going on is that there's a bunch of people who work in unincorporated some county that's not Lane County. But that said, I would end up double checking the data just to be sure that you got it right, because things can
It's
happen.
surprising.
I'd be fascinated to know what the median household income is of the people who are traveling from outside Lane County.
I would not try to get that data from this.
I'm just saying, I have a feeling it's the lower.
This data source purports to report that kind of thing, and what I find is the data is good enough to be believable at the where do people work level, but once you start breaking down in the demographics, the data is just not what I would trust necessarily. Just so you know, this data comes from a combination of the census, where the census is also taking IRS data in some way and doing some statistical magic that they don't talk about. But I've bugged them about this before to see where it was good and where it was bad. And over time, this data has gotten better and better.
I know that we're gonna stick with Lane County among the small kind of satellite communities that we wanna evaluate, but Harrisburg's gotta be the logical candidate to me of the concentration of people that most of people living in Harrisburg are probably coming into Eugene to work, I'm guessing. And there's probably a goodly number from Corvallis or Salem or Albany and elsewhere in the state, who knows. It's surprising though, the proportion still, so at 2015, less than half of Eugene workers are living in Eugene, right?
This is way higher than an awful lot of cities.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Eugene,
but-
Springfield.
But still, I mean, it seems like, okay, interesting, surprising. Where Eugene residents work, question about this, okay, so,
This would be you guys.
insofar, the high 50s, almost 60% of Eugene residents work here in Eugene. Okay, since, and these are, let's see, maybe it's really the other side of where Eugene, where people work, I guess is what I'm trying to get at, because I think you mentioned something earlier about having an address in Eugene for your business, as opposed to, there's some places that have addresses in both cities of Eugene and Springfield. Hospital, for example, might, have a lot of people that are now in Springfield, not in Eugene. And I'm kind of curious, it doesn't really seem to pop out as being reflective, at least in this data, but maybe it is, and I'm just not seeing it.
Two various sources of data. This data is not, as far as I'm aware, using QCEW data as a base. So it's using information from the census and from IRS returns. Maybe it is using some QCEW data. There's black magic going on behind this honestly. That I wouldn't, frankly, I would put Eugene and Springfield together and, not care about the difference, because, if I commute over to Springfield from where I live in South Eugene, it's not much further than if I commuted from South Eugene to Santa Clara. It's the getting out of the city. That's where you start to look at the real public policy impacts. And what I'll say, when we did work for Corvallis, where we were looking at other college towns, and they were very worried about their commute data, because something like 67% of people commuted, who lived in Corvallis, who worked in Corvallis, lived elsewhere. That was what it was. Very high proportion. And the only place we saw that you had the vast majority, well more than 60% living and working in the city, was Flagstaff. And if you imagine Flagstaff, they are isolated. There is nothing around them. But if you're in a region, then people are going to commute. So for instance, I'm working in Tualatin right now, where 7% of people who work in Tualatin live in Tualatin, because they're, the smallest fish in a big pond. But there's a lot of opportunity for commuting and where to live in the region. So Eugene is just after Portland. I don't think I've looked at this for Salem, but Eugene's just after Portland for the relatively high percentage of people who live and work in either Eugene or Springfield.
How do people feel about combining Eugene and Springfield into one category? We call it Eugene Springfield? Okay, great. Simplifies the chart, so that's awesome. And this next one may get a little bit at what you were just talking about. So this is commuting time, and again, I think we would collapse these categories here to be 45 minutes or greater, because again, it's really trying to get at who's commuting a long way. So under 15 minutes or 15 to 29 minutes even, that's a pretty big category actually for our area. I would love for there to be like 15 to 20 minutes, because a half hour is, but I didn't make it up. So under 15 minutes, you know, is pretty consistently about 40% of our workers.
And that suggests that the information we saw in the last chart was correct.
Yeah.
It's, different sources of data. This is purely census, whereas the other one was, the census is on the map tool.
Question. I haven't studied this, but, so if the other chart had, what, 38% work outside the county, and then you have these commute times. I don't know how long it takes to get out of Lane County from Eugene, but I'm just kind of wondering if those percentages make any sense.
I would suggest checking it, check
Yeah.
this to make sure it makes sense. I feel very confident about the other chart, but check this to make sure it makes sense and that the categorization is being done right. But Lane County is not that tall, getting up, exactly, getting up to Harrisburg is what, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, so.
Yeah, I'd say you can't really draw a good conclusion from this because it's definitely less than 30 minutes outside of up to Lynn County.
And same south.
So I think follow-up for me is to double check 39% live outside of Lane County on the other chart.
But just, yeah.
But not necessarily follow up on this one, because this one we feel pretty confident about. Okay, and I can get back to you with that information. And do folks agree with kind of collapsing these two categories here?
Yeah, I'm not sure about collapsing. I mean,
Oh, yeah?
I actually think that data is really useful for a number of other things. So I don't know, I'd be in favor of leaving all the categories there.
Just because we collapse them, the data will still be there. So if I just go to
This thing you can go to.
not yet. Is this what we're just, no. Oh, I think it's all the way at the end. So this is super hard to see, but what it gives me, I wonder if I can, no, it's not gonna make it bigger, but what I have is because that's what I clicked on was the Eugene 2017 data. It gives me all of the data that's in this employment group, so the per capita, the average, all of those things. It's all of the data points before they're collapsed, so we actually do have them here.
Okay.
So I guess it's kind of a question of, do you think it's important to have it in the chart, or is it good enough that it's just in the background table?
You were talking about collapsing just the 45 and 60. Yeah, I think that's fine.
As long as the data is still available in the, okay.
Yeah.
Does everyone else, does that feel comfortable? Okay, great. Okay, that's it. We did it. That was a lot. But I have some good follow-up, and I got some good general head nods on format, and so you'll see revised stuff when we compile everything back together.
In the agenda packet, you had some interesting things about error.
Margin of error?
Margins of error.
That's our next topic. Are folks ready to move on to that?
Sure.
Let's go.
Okay.
Moving things along.
I like it. Okay, so At one point, we had talked about putting whiskers on the bar charts in order to kind of show that wiggle and try to be able to relay to folks that, you know, we're using ACS data. Maybe it's not as much of a trend as you think you're seeing because our sample sizes, et cetera. We moved away from that at the last meeting. Folks felt like showing margin of error would work, and so what I did was we now have margin of error for all of the data points. So if you clicked on that chart like I did before where it showed all the ACS data for Eugene 2017, I'd be able to click on a companion document that is the margin of error for all of those same data points. And so what I did was I just used an example of what it looks like, what it will look like, what it does look like. This is for cost burden. So what I wanted to show you, so you had some confidence that we're pulling in the right data, is that this is showing the margin of error for Eugene for owners that are cost burden of 30 to 34%, with a mortgage, without a mortgage. So we pulled that data in right here, and you can see it in the, it's kind of hard to go back and forth, but that's why I gave it to you ahead of time so that you could see that the numbers were the same. So 691's right here. So if you just went through that whole line, I've got them circled here. And what this is from is this is just a clip from the census itself. So it's showing you the actual number, which would be in our charts, and then the margin of error, which would be in this companion document. Whoa, all sorts of questions. Okay.
So I'm used to margin of errors that are small. Do I read this saying that the estimate is 1622, but it could range plus or minus almost 700? Wow, that's pretty crummy data.
Yeah.
This is why I
Small
say,
sample.
don't sit here and chop up your data into really tiny bits.
I understand that concept.
So when you combine it all back, because we're not recalculating the margin of error, which one
No.
theoretically could do. But when you combine it from the 30% and more, your margin of error there is theoretically at least going to go down, because we've put it together, put it back together. So right there, what you're talking about is a margin of error of about a third. Once you've collapsed that data back down, your margin of error should be a smaller margin of error. The census, the thing to know is this is true for the 2000 census for this type of data. It's true for the 2010 census, and it's true for the ACS. It's just they didn't report this before for the ACS. This is why, frankly, looking at data for census tracts is not usually all that good. I don't consider a margin of error necessarily a problem until we start getting up towards, where it's, plus or minus 100%. It can give you a direction, but that's why I say don't worry about the difference between 60% and 62% when you're starting to chop it up, because it's almost certainly a margin of error.
Good.
I'm just beginning to question if we should be using the margin of error. I think it adds a lot of confusion.
So it's been a while since I've taken stats, and this might be like, is 2 plus 2 blue or something, but is the confidence interval for this relevant, and is it 95, or what's?
I think the confidence interval is 95%, but I don't remember.
Okay.
So, yeah. So Ed, the way I look at margins of error is part of what one is supposed to do when one is the analyst is keep an eye on these sorts of things and make sure they don't get out of hand, and make sure that when somebody who's very well intentioned suggests, let's chop this up instead of one number, median household income, into like 16 numbers, I'm able to look at it and say, yeah, we could look at, median household income by structure type and family type, which is a lot of little boxes, but that's going to be trash data. So I think the margin of error is important for people who really want to understand this, and important for city staff as they're compiling this. But I would expect not to see the public ever look at margin of error here.
Or in the report?
No. No, I don't think so. This was just if people wanted to dig further into it. And really, this is public. When you look up the census cost burden for Eugene, this is the table it gives you. It gives you the estimate right with the margin of error. So it's all out there. But yeah, I totally agree. It's just more for kind of transparency and for our analysis. So we might bring those to you and say, hey, just wanted to flag for you that median income for whatever reason this year had 100% margin of error. What do you guys think about that? It's not going to happen, but just as an example of something like that happened. Okay. Yeah.
If,
All the way up.
all the way up?
I think it's all the way up.
No, it's green,
Yeah,
is
I
it?
think so.
Isn't it green?
Green.
Is that
Yeah.
right? I guess that we're talking about policy issues, and being on the planning commission for several years, I discovered that one of the last things that some of the policymakers get into is the detail. And I can say that now because I'm not on that commission anymore. And I would have a concern, if I look at this and I look at under 30%, or if we look at more than 30% burden, the number of error is incredibly high. And if somebody doesn't recognize that, when we talk about percentages, this could be a big effect if you're saying, whatever our number was, 45% of the population is cost burden. But by the way, that really may be 32% or it may be 65% with these big errors. And I have a real concern about how this data can be used wrong both directions.
So what I would say is when we look at the total number of housing units, 34,000, it's a plus or minus 2,000.
8%.
So it's not a big margin of error when it comes right down to it. We know about where it is, somewhere between 30 and 34,000. If you look at the data over the course of a few different ACSs, since the ACS samples different households and it's doing a bunch of statistical magic, you have a good sense of that. The margin of error will go down when you have the above 30%, and you're looking at both with a mortgage and without a mortgage. This data happens to be chopped up into a lot of little tiny boxes. But if you looked at, say, median household income by tenure, so we've just got total median household income, owner and renter, the margin of error is going to be pretty small there. So what I might suggest taking away from this is not necessarily showing all of the intervening years for a lot of the data, showing a historical year, whatever that is, if that's 2000, 2010, 2011, whatever the historical year was, and then the change to now. And what staff has to do as they're compiling the report is look at the intervening years and just make sure that something weird isn't going on with the current year. And recognize this is the danger with all of this data, is helping people understand that when you see a change, it's not necessarily a trend, even if it happens 2 or 3 years in a row.
So I guess the only question I have about that, and we can revisit it, we don't have to decide right now because the system is still internal. But if it is confusing, it's a lot more information, is that something that we say, if you want margin of error data, please send us an email and we can provide that to you. And it's something that we have for our analysis, and it's not part of the whole packet of data that we put out with the public interface. I'm just not sure, because we want it to be useful and digestible information, and so what's that right balance?
Okay, so if there's not a big margin of error for the data set that we have and we can rely upon, it's important for policymakers about the differences for cost burden between owners and for owners and renters. When we get to this about whether you do or don't have a mortgage, I mean, I guess I'm just wondering, like, maybe this gets into the realm of good to know if people drill down into it. But what this kind of tells me, you're exactly right. I mean, once you start parsing all this out into smaller and smaller increments, your margin of error and chances of the numbers being wrong are greater. But what you're really finding out is that among the 1/3 of the people who are owners who don't have a mortgage, and presumably either because you got so much money that you paid it off already and you're younger, or you've been living there so long that you finally paid off your home and you don't have a mortgage, that's telling you a different thing. And maybe policymakers want to drill down into that information. Good to have, but I just wonder if this whole set of information, especially if we want to parse it out the way it's done here, is really all that relevant, or does it really help us, or does it answer questions that are 4 or 5 down the line from somebody who are going to be asking about something that really relates to making policy choices?
So if I were to look at cost burden data, and I were to look at the difference between owner and renter, I would go, whoa, renters are much more cost burden than owners. Do owners not have any problems? Well, no, some owners have problems. Owners who are cost burdened who don't have a mortgage are certainly an indicator of a potential problem. But they're a pretty small percentage of owners who don't have a mortgage, pretty small number in the end of households. And so I think it was Tualatin, there was a decision maker asking the question, I've heard a lot of people can't afford to keep their homes here, so they're older. And I think this is rampant. And I was able to look at it and go, okay, well, when you look at households without a mortgage, they're more likely to be older. And I was able to tell them that something like 5% of owners didn't have a mortgage and were cost burdened. So it's a very small percentage. That's the kind of thing that sort of data answers. I think that's like 2 or 3 bullet points below the big bullet points of, we've got a lot of renter cost burden and a lot more severely cost burdened renters. And what's our public policy response to that?
It's also that in order to make this chart, that's great. In order to make this chart, we had to have this data, right? And so it combines it together. And so we simplified it and just said cost burden or not. But this is actually how the data comes in. And so unfortunately, it means there's a whole bunch of margin of error that you kind of don't really want to look at because it breaks it out so much more and we're collapsing it.
Yeah.
I thought, Beth, you did a great job of giving a little synopsis there, and if that could be boiled into just a paragraph for the document that sort of becomes the summary, just a cautionary note about data and margins of error with just some of that kind of language. I think that'd be helpful and kind of responsible as a party promulgating all this data. But I don't think this, I agree, that shocked the hell out of me when I looked at that. And it's like, what?
And it looks worse than it is. So yeah, that's the sort of cautionary tale that we include in our reports these days also, as well. You don't want to get so far out there that you undercut yourself and say this data is absolutely meaningless. But when I work in census tract, I kind of think to myself, this data is meaningless.
Just one last follow-up on my request about the number of people per household divided by, or rent burden divided by number of people per household. If we could get more reliable data instead of categorizing it by 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe grouping them so it's you'd at least have like 1 to 2 people and 3+ or something like that might be helpful.
And I'm not sure that that data exists. I couldn't find it quickly.
Okay.
But I was searching on a little thing. But yeah, that would probably be a better thing, you know, looking at single-person households, 2-person households, 3 or more.
That just reminded me, when we talked about the rent and how much, I'm looking at the charts from last time, like the median gross rent, I feel like there was a question about how much, like that $937, what does that get you? Is that a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom? I feel like we brought that up, and then that kind of goes back into your question, how many people are living in that $937 apartment, house? Is it one person? So I feel like someone asked that question, if we could put that data in there, because $937 doesn't even buy you a 1-bedroom. But, so just, what is that for?
And remember that census data about rent costs tend to be pretty poor. It just, I'm not entirely sure why it's so poor. Maybe it's just that rent changes so much in a year or two that it just seems poor. Maybe Rick has an opinion about this, having done rent surveys over so many years. Or the fact that we're looking at everything from very low quality housing up to newly built housing. Yeah. There's some housing out there that rents for $200 and $300 a month that I think I'm going to guess that I wouldn't want to rent. It's in very poor condition. But you can look at average number of people per household for renters, and you get that number. It's a little higher usually, I think, than owners, although I could be wrong about that. But you can certainly get that. That's an easy to get data. If you start looking at, I'm pretty sure you can get median rent by number of bedrooms. You might be able to get that, but again, you know, you're looking at census data that may just not be as current as people are hoping for. So it may be better to be looking at other data sources on that one.
Great. Great discussion. Thank you.
Are there any other questions about these 3 main topics that we talked tonight about? Comments? Okay.
Good work.
Well, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your insight.
Crunching.
Upcoming meetings?
What?
Oh, I was thinking upcoming meetings?
Yeah, that was, I'm
Oh.
getting there. Okay, just want to make sure everybody had a chance to chime in. All right, so we had previously scheduled a meeting in a couple of weeks, I think, on the 19th or something. And so Heather says that the staff is not going to be quite ready for discussing the next topic, and so that will push that meeting into October, which will necessitate 2 meetings in October rather than 2 this month. So I guess I'll turn it over to you as far as what you're thinking as far as potential dates.
Yeah, so it'd just be trading the September 19th, I think, for October 3rd. So the first, so it'd be a month from this Thursday, from today, basically. And it would still be urban reserves, but we just need some more time to develop the materials for that meeting. And then we're still anticipating holding a meeting on October 17th as well that would be split between urban reserves and monitoring. So it'd be helpful to know, I know this, we're just letting you know this now, but we wanted to let you know as soon as possible. It'd be helpful to know if a lot of people that won't work for. I know we had asked you to hold the first week, but I know that we also took it off the agenda, so. And I'm seeing maybe some folks can't.
Might.
No.
So who can't make the October 3rd meeting?
Oh, can't make.
Can't make.
cannot make it.
Cannot make it.
Okay, okay, well, I will get that information back to Rebecca, and would people be willing for us to send out a poll, or is there more of a no interest in 2 meetings in October?
I think a doodle poll's fine.
think a
Yeah,
poll.
we'll send it out.
Okay, we'll send that out.
Okay.
Thank you. So I really apologize about that. We try to stick to a schedule, but sometimes it doesn't work out, so.
Okay. Anything else for the good of the order?
Tell Audrey I missed her.
Tonight, yeah, we gave her the night off. Can you believe it? Gosh.
Never
I
given
will.
15 minutes of your
minutes.
life back.
Yay. Yeah.
All right, well, thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
It's good to see
everybody.
you.
You guys are data warriors.
Oh.